Let's start with this guy. Next slide. I'm not going to go through all of these, but I'd be happy to talk with you about them. I have a couple of these here with me. A little document that the David Horowitz Freedom Center published called Muslim Brotherhood in the Obama Administration. I'm going to focus on just one of these guys because he's a homeboy. Interestingly enough, Freedom and Justice is the name of the party that the Muslim Brotherhood recently established to try to take over Egypt, and did for a time. Next slide. Mohammed El-Abiyari has some colorful things in his background, including defending this character, Anwar al-Awlaki, fortunately now no longer with us, but formerly a guy who helped the 9/11 hijackers from an area near me in Falls Church, Virginia, and subsequently ran al-Qaeda operations from not, again, one of our kind of people, I think. Next slide. El-Abiyari has also been a defender of the Holy Land Foundation and its operations here in Texas. Next slide. He also helped one of the worst of the Muslim Brotherhood front organizations called the Assembly of Muslim Jurists of America in how to run sophisticated influence operations. This is actually available on the web if you're interested. Next slide. Despite all that, he managed to be put on the advisory board of the Public Safety Commission right here in Texas. Next slide. That got him an appointment to the Homeland Security Department's advisory committee up in Washington, D.C. I was just told coming in this morning that he's just been reappointed to this, by the way. Next slide. He got a security clearance in connection with serving on that board, which he promptly used, next slide, to try to run an operation against this guy when he was running for president on the grounds that he was an Islamophobe. Next slide. Despite all of this, that guy, who until recently was the director of the FBI, gave this guy an award for his service to our country. Next slide. They chose to do it down here at the FBI Academy in Quantico, Virginia. Interestingly enough, the Academy is where we train our FBI agents in how to do things like protect us against enemies, foreign and domestic. Next slide. Shortly after they got this award from Robert Mueller, a series of articles begins appearing in an online publication called Wired Magazine, written by a really radical leftist by the name of Spencer Ackerman. Next slide. The subject of these is that there's all kinds of hateful stuff in the training materials in the FBI curriculum for training our agents against Islamists. El-Abiyari liked that. Next slide. And a few days later, Ackerman writes another one, thanking him and publishing photographs taken by a cell phone in the FBI Training Academy's library of these materials that are deemed offensive to Muslims. Next slide. On the 4th of October, a few days later, Mohammed El-Abiyari and a bunch of other guys, leftists as well as Islamists, write the FBI director insisting that all of this hateful material be purged from the FBI's training materials. Next slide. A few days later, 57 of these guys and their friends, and both the left and the Islamist community, write this fellow, John Brennan, at the time the Homeland Security Advisor to the President of the United States, said to him, "It's not enough to purge the files of the FBI of this hateful material. You need it out of the military's files, out of the Homeland Security's files, out of the intelligence community's files." In other words, we don't want anybody responsible for defending you against these guys to know what they're up to. This is called information dominance, and it is part and parcel of running stealthy civilization jihadist operations, because obviously, if we don't know what to look for, it's harder to fight. Next slide. On November 11th, John Brennan agreed to do that. He's going on to become the director of the Central Intelligence Agency, by the way. Next slide. One of your own, right out here in Tyler. Louis Gohmert, one great American. He inquired of this lady, who is fortunately no longer the Homeland Security Secretary, but nonetheless asked her about this LABR guy. What is up with this? She promised to get back to him, and didn't. Next slide. LABR, and what I've just shown you, in terms of what I would argue is at least circumstantial evidence of a sophisticated influence operation at the highest levels of the United States government, is just one example of the trouble you've got right here in Texas. And that's T for trouble. I'll give you just a quick run through on this. Next slide, please. Holy Land Foundation 5. These are 5 co-conspirators who were convicted in the Holy Land Foundation trial despite Mohammed al-Abiyari's best efforts, on the basis in part of that document I showed you before, the strategic plan of the Muslim Brotherhood found in Annandale, Virginia. Next slide. Mark this man. Mufid Abdul Qadir, one of the most important of this gang because he was one of their biggest fundraisers. It was a fundraising operation for Hamas, that designated terrorist organization. He was convicted along with the rest of them. Next slide. One of the things that got him such high marks as a fundraiser was he had a rock band that he used to go promote his program, in which they would sing about the glories of jihad and holy war, martyrdom and suicide bombing and so on. Next slide. A couple of things that are also interesting about this guy, in addition to him being a good fundraiser for Hamas, is he was related to the leader of Hamas, Khalid Mashal. The next slide will show you one other interesting thing about him. He was an engineer for the city of Dallas, which prompted the FBI at one point to say, quote, Mufid is believed to have access to detailed technical plans pertaining to the city's infrastructure. This was a warning to the then mayor of Dallas that went unremarked. That's kind of a problem, don't you think? Yeah. Next slide. 59, I believe it is, mosques in the greater Dallas area. Not all of them, as I said earlier, are a problem. Just most of them. If you see Islamic Society of Dallas, or Islamic Center of Dallas, or Richardson, or Plano, or what have you, that's Muslim Brotherhood. It's been created by one of those groups that was on that list that I mentioned to you in the back of this memorandum, called the North American Islamic Trust. Its purpose is to build or take over mosques and turn them into centers for promoting the Muslim Brotherhood civilization jihad. Next slide. You are familiar with this gentleman wearing his Army regulation beard. Now a convict, fortunately, after almost 4 years. But he was charged and found guilty of what? Workplace violence. Despite the families and survivors' pleas to have it be treated as terrorism, not least, so they would be treated as victims of terrorism in an act of war, Purple Hearts and benefits and so on, and also his own assertion that he was doing it for jihad. He meant to martyr himself. Next slide. You're familiar probably with this story a few years back. Are you?
Yeah.
This is the phenomenon known as honor killing. That misogyny against women right here in Texas. Next slide. This is a fellow, I don't know if any of you might know him. I'm told he's been a prominent figure in the Dallas business community, technology specifically, all kinds of ties to the Muslim Brotherhood. Indeed, he is now the Muslim Brotherhood Prime Minister of an interim government in Syria that we're now, as I mentioned earlier, trying to bring to power there. Next slide. This fellow tried to blow up a skyscraper in downtown Dallas not so long ago. Fortunately, he thought he was buying his explosives from the FBI instead of from people who would actually give him the real stuff. Otherwise, that skyscraper would probably have been gone. Next slide. Then there's this, more recently. fellow arrested down in San Antonio. Hezbollah. This is not the Muslim Brotherhood, these are the Shia dudes, but they happen to also be in the jihad business. They too want to bring Sharia here. They too want to kill in order to make us feel subdued, as the Quran says, and therefore submit to it. Next slide. Oh, by the way, small point. He was looking for a sensitive position within the U.S. government when he was nabbed at the border. Next slide. Speaking of education, Alice and I have been working on this a bit. We just recently beat an effort by followers of this Islamist cultist by the name of Fethullah Gulen to build a publicly funded charter school in my home neighborhood of Loudoun County, Virginia. Unfortunately, we haven't been able to keep them from having 38 of them here in Texas. Harmony schools, excuse me. It's hard to keep up with these guys. They're building them frantically. These are incubators for Islamism. They're skilled, they're creative, they're clever, they're cunning. They don't use terms like Sharia, let alone jihad. It's all couched in Turkish nationalism. This is a Turk, though he runs his multi-billion-dollar school and other business operations from an armed camp in the Pocono Mountains of Pennsylvania. But you've got these guys training your kids right here in Texas, and your tax dollars are at work enabling them to do it. And it's one of the things that I'm so proud of Alice and the team that she's pulled together are working on, is at least to expose this so that parents know, as with this stuff, what's being taught, what's being inculcated. And it's not just this, science, technology, engineering, and math, STEM program. It's insinuating along the trail this idea of the glories of Turkish nationalism and what goes with it, the supremacism of Islamism. It just like to stipulate that the infiltration in our government of people like Muhammad El-Aghyari is not just affecting what we can know and not know, what we can say and not say. It's helping to shape all kinds of policies, some of which, as I showed you in that first set of slides, are unbelievable. Like helping the Muslim Brotherhood take over countries from which they hope to establish the ability to take over the world. And yet we're doing it, including funding them and arming them, as I mentioned. Next slide, please. 5 of these folks, including your own Louis Gilbert, of course Michelle Bachman, Trent Franks of Arizona, Lynn Westmoreland of Georgia, and Tom Rooney of Florida, in June of last year, in April of last year, wrote to, the next slide, the inspectors general of these 5 departments, saying, in part on the basis of that course that I mentioned to you, MuslimBrotherhoodInAmerica.com, that there are people in these various agencies with associations with the Muslim